All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for all of your patience as we sorted out that tech issue. We're going to go ahead and get started on our first webinar for 2024. So I'm just going to go over like a little bit of the housekeeping just so we're aware of like how this platform works. Just so you guys are aware that this webinar is being recorded. So if you do have a colleague that is missing out, we'll go ahead and send the recording to the email that you registered, and we'll also upload all this content on our YouTube channel. That's at the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. So again, just go onto YouTube, type in the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, and we should be on there. Go ahead and subscribe so you can always go back and look at the recording if you missed a part. We slotted this presentation pretty much for the hour, so we have about like 5 to 10 minutes set aside for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please use that. Access the drop-down menu and you'll see like a questions tab. You can type all your questions in there throughout the presentation, or you can wait until the end when we open it up for Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye out, so if you do have a question, I'll make sure to hold on to it and ask once we get into that Q&A part of the presentation. So for those of you who are in here, try to use that chat function and just tell us your name, your position with the organization, and its location. So we have a good mass here, so let's just go ahead and get started. So again, I want to welcome everybody. This project started back in 2021 thanks to the Home Depot Foundation. To give you a little bit of background as to what we do here at the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, or NCHV for short, our goal is to put an end to veteran homelessness, and we do so by sharing best practices, working in the policy space, and connecting service providers, housing professionals, and people who are at risk or experiencing homelessness with very helpful resources. So our series for this year is focused on elevating the voices of homeless veterans, and we'll go about it in about a couple of ways. So this part is focused on influencing the public narrative on homelessness through how we talk and share stories about it. And the next part will cover how we empower homeless veterans in the electoral space. Today's webinar is on shaping the media narrative, and we'll delve into the ways we strengthen our advocacy efforts and how we talk about homelessness in a way that's informed and capable of changing people's minds and hearts. So as folks are aware of the point in time 2023, estimate there was a 7.4% increase in homeless veterans since 2022. So the growth in the homeless veteran population represents a clear need for more housing and expanding supportive services. So we need to continue making the case on or for veterans and fulfilling their unmet needs. So the way we talk about homelessness certainly matters. And simply put, the conversations that we have with our friends, family, and colleagues stream into a broader narrative on the issue. And as folks continue to struggle with housing, it's evident that the narrative is being challenged by those who believe that homelessness can't be solved. So we hear the common myths and misconceptions, and those narratives are incredibly harmful, yet they've shaped public discourse. So we need to understand that, one, housing and homelessness are two very incredibly complex subjects to talk about. So we need to understand how we can counter that misinformation and those stigmas, and how to really capture the reality of a crisis in a way that can drive support for our goal. There's a really powerful story to tell that unmasks all those myths and brings people together. So we'll discuss those essential components and how we can change the conversation about homelessness into an empathetic public narrative. And so we'll do that by we'll explore how we can develop a strong message, a compelling message on your channels, and we can identify the best practices around effective writing and storytelling. So today we are joined by Marisol Bello, Executive Director of the Housing Narrative Lab. Marisol has spent a career championing the stories of voices of people with lived experience. So they lead in creating the solutions that help every family thrive. She started as a career journalist, most recently at USA Today, telling the stories of families working to make ends meet, and then in the nonprofit world, where she currently leads narrative strategies to change the hearts and minds about those living on the brink and move people to action. Thank you, Marisol, for joining us. I'll leave the floor open to you, and don't forget, audience, to use that questions tab. Let's get started.
Super, Jay, thank you so much. And again, thank you everyone for your patience as we maneuvered through some technical challenges there. But I am so excited to be here with you all today to talk about how important it is to understand narrative and really understand narrative systems and how each of us has a role in being able to shape and change how people are thinking about our issue. So let's go to the next slide. So let's first, I'll do first a quick intro. My name again is Marisol Bayo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Narrative Lab. And at the lab, our work is all about helping the public understand the realities of who experiences housing insecurity and why, and homelessness and why, so that we can build support for the real solutions. And we do that in 4 ways. We do a lot of narrative research. Some of you may be familiar with the narrative research we did with the National Homelessness Law Center on the SCOTUS case, the Grants Pass case. So we do a lot of local, statewide, and national research, narrative research, to help us figure out how to talk to folks about these very thorny issues and help them figure out how to think about this issue in a way that will lead to the solutions. We do a lot of education and training, so a lot of webinars and in-person panels, and I probably have met many of you already on this call. We work a lot in coalition and collaboration. You all know how important it is for all of us to work together, and it is so important when we are thinking about narrative and looking to move narrative forward that we work together and join forces, because as you'll see in a moment, it's a really critical element of changing narratives. And then the last one is around communications, strategic communication support. We provide a lot of capacity building and technical assistance for organizations as they are looking to shift and change narratives. Let's go to the next piece. Wonderful. Now, I'm going to rely on Jay here for a moment because I am not a comfortable GoToWebinar user, but I would love to do some maybe intros in the chat. And so maybe you can tell me your names, your organizations, and one word that describe what home means to you. So maybe in the chat.
In reference to the housekeeping from earlier, the chat is in that drop-down menu where it's right beneath, I think it's beneath questions. So yeah, you'll be able to type a message in there and then you can just hit send and we'll be able to see it. Thank you.
Just your name, your org or affiliation, how you come into this space, and one word to describe what home means to you. Don't be shy. There's several of us on this call. And I'll kick us off.
Alternatively, you can type it in questions. I think that might work for everybody.
All right. Great. Elena, good to meet you, Grand Rapids. All right, awesome. All right, Kim, good to see you. All right, what's one word that describes what home means to you? Looking at questions, I'm looking at the chat. All right, Lauren, good to see you from Indiana. All right, others. And again,
sorry, go ahead, Marisol.
No, go ahead, Jay. Just apologies because I'm not as well versed, so I'm moving through some of these chats messages. But if you maybe want to call out a few, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. I want to make aware for the folks that yes, you can't see each other's responses, so it's kind of a blind, shoot your shot kind of thing. Yeah.
I did not. So again, my friends, I am so used to Zoom, understood. Okay, so then even more important, Jay, if you read out a few for us.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of folks here saying that a home is a safe haven. Security and safety. Home means privacy. Home means safe space, so really just kind of builds off this greater sentiment that home is like a safe place where you should feel secure. I see one that says home is hope, home is nesting,
Oh, I love that.
home is where family is. These are very beautiful answers.
I
All
love
correct.
that. All right, wonderful. So thinking about what home means to us, I want you to think about how often we are telling the story of the need for housing and how housing is a basic need through the lens that you all just outlined in terms of what home means to us. So maybe thinking a little bit about that, like how often do we tell the story in that kind of way? Let's go to the next slide. Yep. Thank you so much. So right now, a lot of the ways that our sector tells the story of home is very hit or miss. It's like, you know, one talking point, one group does a series of talking points here. Somebody else does talking points there. Somebody else does some stories this way. Somebody else does some stories that way. And we don't really have a more unified way of thinking about a narrative. Like what does a broad shared narrative look like? And when that happens, what ends up happening in the real world is that when we are telling our stories, it looks like this, right? One flower at a time, sometimes one flower at a time on concrete. And so it becomes so important for us to think about our narrative and our narrative ecosystem, right? Understanding that narrative lives in an ecosystem. And what does that look like? So that we can go from this one flower at a time, and then let's jump to the next screen, right? So we go from where we had been to this, right? To creating this vibrant, blooming narrative garden, right? And so much of thinking about narrative is about understanding what is that narrative ecosystem? What does that look like? And how all of us can engage in the narrative ecosystem so we can do this. We want to go from that one flower at a time to this vibrant, blooming narrative garden. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the narrative ecosystem. At the Housing Narrative Lab, we think about narrative very much as an ecosystem. And often what happens is folks think about narrative as narrative equals communications or narrative equals messaging, right? All of those pieces are a part of narrative, but they are not the narrative, right? And they're not the narrative ecosystem. They are very much a part of that narrative ecosystem. But for us to be able to share narratives and make the transformational change that we need to, it's important for us to understand all of the elements and all of the pieces. At the lab, it starts with community values and narrative research. I mentioned that a lot of the work we do starts with narrative research. But even before we get to the research piece, we want to understand what are the community values. That's where the research often will come in really handy because we need to understand if there are communities we're talking to or working with or being a part of, what is this community value and how do we help them to understand the solutions to housing and to homelessness. And so this is where understanding community values and research come in, because the research helps us start to think about how do we talk to those communities based on the values they hold. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the slide on framing. So we have the research, we have community values, and then once we think about, okay, this is a research, this is what it's showing us in terms of how to approach varying groups of people and varying audiences, we think about framing. So framing is really about how we approach a conversation. right? There's an organization called the Frameworks Institute, and they define framing as the choices we make in what we say and how we say it. It's about what we emphasize, what we explain, what we leave out. So here's an example. Do we start a conversation talking about a policy? Do we start a conversation talking about money and how much it's going to cost? Or do we start a conversation with someone's story and show how that person would benefit from the policy or any investment in housing? And these choices are really important because they affect how people are going to hear us, what they understand, right? And then in the end, how they move, the actions that they take, which really is so much about the work that we are doing, is helping people move to action. And so there is a science to framing, and it's all about helping us to be heard and understood by audiences that we want to be heard and understood by. Let's go to the next slide. Great. And again, that framing piece is about the choices that we make and what we make. And I actually want to just do one more example about framing. It's a concrete example. It's a famous example of researchers where they talked to people that were buying groceries. And they said to them, do you want to buy this pound of beef that is 80% lean or 20% fat, or excuse me, 20% fat, right? And so even though the numbers for the 20% fat is smaller, and 80% lean and 20% fat is telling you the exact same thing, right? Most people went with 80% lean because it sounds healthier, it feels healthier, even though they are the exact same thing, right? And so that's an example of the power of framing. Let's go to the next slide. And you can bump the next slide after that too, because the next slide will show us some, great. And so once we think framing, the way we put the framing out into the world is through storytelling, messaging, and strategic communications, right? Storytelling is how we as humans communicate. It is elemental to who we are as people and how we understand the world, how we talk to each other, how we build empathy, how we build connection, how we build understanding is through storytelling. It's how we understand numbers and facts. The messages are the words, the sounds, right? The visuals that we see in those stories. And then the strategic communications, which is the thing that most people associate with narrative. The strategic communications is actually the way that we put that out into the world, right? Are we going to put this out on social media? Are we talking to the press? Is our executive director going to do a speech? Who's going to speak at the town hall meeting? What do our graphics look like, right? Strategic communications embodies all of that. Let's go to the next slide. To the blue. Yep. Thank you. And so here you're going to see policy. You are going to see mass media and culture, campaign and organizing, and the interpersonal, right? And those are then the ways that all of the stories, right, and the messaging in those stories and the strategic communications that helped you figure out the ways you were going to put this information out or these stories out. This is where it shows up in your policy work, in your campaign work, right? In pop culture and media, every news story, every TV show, every book. In the interpersonal, every time you have a conversation with someone at a table. I went to a Seder on Monday and with a series of friends and folks that I had met. And I talked a lot about the work that I do. I talked a lot about SCOTUS, and I framed the case before the Supreme Court as one about the kind of communities. We're making a choice about the kind of community we want. Are we a community that we're going to arrest, fine, and ticket people because we want to deal with the visibility of homelessness? Or are we going to choose to be a community that solves homelessness? And in that table of 20-something people, I was able to frame the conversation in that way. So all those people walked away with a different kind of understanding of that work and the work that we all are doing. Let's go to the next slide, because when we take all of those pieces that I just mentioned, all of that comes together to form narrative. And you can keep going to the next slide. Oh, let's see. Sorry, I'm not following it. All of those pieces come together to form narratives. Apologies, David, if you can go back to the narrative slide, because narrative is the big story. That is the collection of stories that show up in the media, politics, policy, pop culture, the barbecue, and the dinner table. And when you have this collection of stories, now you can go to the next series of slides. When you have that collection of stories and you have that a lot, right, coming from a lot of different places, that's how we start to influence public mindset, public discussion, and social norms, because those are the pieces that then will help us move people to action. Why does this matter? Let's go to the next slide. Right? Let's talk a little bit about why this matters and how narratives form. Again, narratives are about story. Let's go to the next slide. Narratives don't have a set form or structure. And David, feel free to keep moving the slides as I'm talking without me, if I forget to say next slide. Narratives are about the collection of stories, but they don't have a set form or structure. They exist, right? And so it really is about everyone, everywhere, all the time. The way that we are able to shape and move narratives are through scale, consistency, and repetition. Those are the three things we need to start to influence and persuade and help people understand the realities of the work that we are doing. Everyone, everywhere, all the time. Remember that one flower on the concrete? That's not going to help people understand the realities. It's when all of us are doing this all the time, repeatedly, right? And really helping people understand what home means. That's when we start to make some change. We can go to the next slide. And that narrative building keeps happening until we start to, right, permeate those start to permeate, so we start to influence public discourse and social norms, right? We're influencing the way that people understand and engage with a topic or a group of people, right? Where now the perceptions have shifted and are changing. So why does this matter? Let's go to why does this matter? Yep. Why does this matter? It matters because people act based on their feelings and their perceptions. I know that a lot of times we want to go into facts and numbers, but the work we are doing is about helping people understand our work so that we can build support for our solutions, for the solutions that we know work, right? The evidence-based solutions. And for that to happen, people need to understand what that means. But they won't understand it just on the facts and figures. You have to first help them understand it based on their beliefs and their feelings. Let's go to the next graph, because they're going to support the solutions that they believe are the problem. So I'll give you an example. We can go to the next slide while I do that. I'll give you an example. If they believe that homelessness is caused because people are making bad choices, when we say to them, we have to follow the housing first model and provide people with a home and then the services they need, they're going to think, why are we doing that and giving that to people who are making bad choices, right? But if they understand that broken systems are what's forcing people into homelessness, right, then the solutions that we are providing then make sense, because they're like, oh, yeah, there's a lot of systems that are beyond people's control that are pushing and forcing them into homelessness. So when you tell me now we have to provide people home first and then the services that they need to be whole, that starts to make sense in a different kind of way. So let's go to the next slide. I love to include this quote when I'm talking about narratives so that people can really, it really helps to kind of solidify what may feel amorphous, right? But narratives are about invisible power. Narrative is about power. Whoever holds the power gets to shape the narrative. I want you to think about the history of this country and the narratives that are told about the history of this country, right? So thinking about narratives are about invisible power, how perceptions, belief systems, and ideologies shape the way people define what is right and what is wrong. And this quote comes from Fumi Ntetswa, who's a South African advocate and social justice advocate. And so really helps us kind of get grounded in why narratives are so important to our work. Let's go to the next 2 slides. We're going to skip this question. I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk a little bit about the bad news, but not for too long because y'all know what the bad news is. So let's go to the next few slides. We are having a hard time with the narrative around housing and homelessness. This is why this matters. Let's go to the next slide. Right? We know that the dominant narrative is one of personal failing, one of arresting, jailing, and fining people, and one of scarcity. And we're also facing a cynicism from the public that believes that we can't solve homelessness, right? So that's a little bit of the bad news. Let's give you some examples. Why don't you go to the next slide? Are you all seeing that? David, it seems to be starting and stopping a lot on my end.
Yeah, Marisol, it looks like the video, I don't think folks can hear it either.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. Well, that's fine. I will tell you about it. It is Prager University. Many of you may be familiar with Prager University and the Cicero Institute. And they are groups that want to dismantle the housing first model, which we know has been so successful, particularly in helping to solve homelessness among veterans, right? It's a really prime example of this model at work. And Prager and Cicero Institute and like-minded organizations have been using first of all, their belief really is around they want folks to be tested for things like drug use first before or some kind of treatment before they're able to have any kind of housing, which obviously we all know has a lot of does make sense. And so one of the things that the opposition is doing and has been very successful in is using narrative. And in this video, they paint a very stark, dramatic, and horrific view of the challenges that people are having on the street, but they frame it. Remember the framing that I talked about in terms of the ecosystem? They frame it as these people are out there choosing to be out there, that folks are out there choosing to use drugs. They are framing this very much as an issue of personal choice, which we know clearly comes with so many challenges and is not the case for so many people. Let's go to the next slide. And I'm using these examples so that you could see how the other side is using narrative to their benefit. This is we did some research, narrative research in Tulsa, and the Cicero Institute actually is also doing some work in Omaha, trying to, in Oklahoma, trying to push for some of the policies that they want to dismantle housing first. And again, they are really leaning into a narrative framing around people who are experiencing homelessness as choosing to be there and as dangerous. And so that's the bad news, is that the other side is using narrative in very harmful and dangerous ways. Let's go to the next slide, because there is good news. Woohoo! The good news is that we can change the narrative, right? We want to make people more open to the big solutions and have them be more likely to support those evidence-based solutions. And we can do that by activating hope and love and community and all of these things, sort of values that can help people start to see the realities in a different kind of way. So our work is going to be around shifting the framing, right, around the true nature of it. How are we bringing out the dignity of people and who they are? So the next series of slides are going to be all about that, right? So for us at the lab, we call these our narrative essentials, right? And they're really about thinking about how to start to frame the narratives that you tell in all of your work. So I include this as an example here. Let me back up. Shared values are all about what is the thing that we all value that is important to us, right? I talked about community values early on. Maybe it's an audience that values community and unity, right? In Minnesota, we did research, and that was a strong value. We as Minnesotans, right? Or maybe the value for some people is parents and future generations. What is the thing that we value? So establishing that shared value becomes really important. It's how I started this conversation. What does home mean to you? Those are your values about home. So Hidden Brain is one of my favorite podcasts, and there was an episode where they're talking about how are we thinking of talking to the other side, or even talking to people that don't always agree with us. And the host, Shankar Vedantam, and his guest talked a little bit about how important it is to build connection, and how connection helps us to see the other side. And they said connection and moral empathy are prerequisites to connection. If you want to change hearts and minds, you have to understand what's in those hearts to begin with. Most of us try to bypass this requirement by focusing on what's inside our own heart and our own mind. And that episode, if you get a chance to listen to it, was about changing hearts and minds. But in order to change hearts and minds, you have to start with the hearts of the person that you are talking to. Right? What is that connection point? And then building from there. So the first essential for us is shared value. Let's go to the next slides. Yep, we can keep going. As you can see, these are some more examples of shared values. Everybody needs a safe and quality, affordable place to live. Everyone needs a home to succeed. And these are some more examples about home. Home is a shared value, right? What does home mean to you? At our rally on Monday, we were talking about housing equals justice, housing equals dignity, housing equals healthcare, housing equals safety, right? All the rally signs were all about that. The second narrative essential is all about leaning into unity and community values. I mentioned the work that we are doing that we did in Minnesota, where the unity piece was so important. People want to be a part of something, right? It's important to them. So it's important for us to describe people working together and coming together. We've done this thing before. We've done hard things before. We can do hard things again. The previous slide was about race and centering race in our messaging and in our narratives, because we know that there is a lot of disparity in race in terms of who experiences homelessness and why. But often that is a very hard thing for people to want to talk about. And so centering the value of no matter who we are, whether we're Black or white, Latino or Asian, Native or newcomer, right? We want the same things. We want to ensure that we build communities where all of us can live, can work, can be safe, can thrive. So the second essential is all about leaning into unity and community. How our communities are stronger when everyone has a home. The third one is all about going on offense. And I love this one because sometimes a lot of our work is all about telling people what it's not. Homelessness is not a crime, right? Homelessness is not something else, right? We focus a lot on the not, which means that we then are having the framing is still from the other side's perspective, right? Versus, right? Or, and here's a good example, right? Often we hear that the people that are experiencing homelessness on our streets came from outside. They're not from here. And we will say that's not true. The people that are experiencing homelessness, that's, you know, they actually come from this community. They're not outsiders. So we're repeating their frame and arguing the case from the opposition's frame. But here's a framing that says most of the people that are experiencing homelessness, right, are either from the communities in which they're experiencing homelessness, or they've been living here for a really long time. And we know this from so many of the studies. So this is where we go on offense. Don't repeat what the other side is saying, reframe what the other side is saying. And, you know, avoid wonky things and the numbers and the program names and all of the acronyms that we sometimes will rely on. Here's another example around how we talk about housing first. Let me just go to the first slide. Housing first is a good example of the wonk, not wonk, or clarity. So good example. Housing first is an evidence-based approach to ending homelessness that centers on quickly moving people experiencing homelessness into independent and permanent housing, and then providing additional support and services as needed. That came from a website with someone talking about housing first. So how many of you, think about how many of you would join a movement that describes something like this if you were not in this space, okay? Versus the second one, okay? No matter who you are, no matter who we are, we all need a home to be safe, healthy, and thriving. Providing a home and additional services to those who need a little more support are proven solutions to help folks rebuild their lives, right? Not just about wordsmithing, because somebody might look at this and say, well, you just wrote it differently. It's actually about how cognitively people are going to receive the information. The first one, if you're a policy person, you're down with it. You're like, yep, I got you. I'm a policy person. I'm a science person. It's all good. The second one is for everyone else. Did we go to the second slide? Yep, the second slide. There you go. That's the second slide. No matter who we are, we all need a home to be safe, healthy, and thriving. Providing a home and additional services to those who need a little more support are proven solutions to help folks rebuild their lives. Let's go to the next slide. I'll give you another example of what that looks like. Y'all know this one? There's no place like home, right? Popular culture, it's a popular culture way of talking about home. We all know the movie, The Wiz, The Wizard of Oz. Here's how our nonprofits say it. Individuals who have experienced homelessness and are placed in permanent supportive housing are found to have generally positive effects on health and well-being as a result of their stable environment. One is how we talk to regular folks. The other one is how we talk to ourselves. But we also talk to the second example. We'll even use that when talking to folks. Folks won't respond to that, right? Folks who are not in our space. Let's go to the next slide. It looks like since we have some trouble with video, we won't play this one necessarily, but show lived experience. And that showing lived experience looks like can look like a variety of ways. One is actually have the people who are experiencing this issue, who have experienced this issue, they lead. They lead in the narrative change, they lead in the storytelling, they lead on how they want to tell their stories. That's one very powerful way that lived experience shows up. Lived experience also shows up in how we talk about the issue. We can talk about more people are spending more than half of their rent, half of their income to pay for rent versus having having enough food to eat. They're having to make choices. We are having to make choices about, are we going to live in a place and spend more than half of our income, or are we going to buy food, right? So showing, right, that like, what does it actually look like when you don't have a home, right? In other ways to think about that is showing the connection between housing insecurity and homelessness and jobs, health and well-being. We can't be healthy if you don't have a place to live. If you don't have a job that helps you, pays you enough, a livable wage, you don't have a place to live, right? Education, how are our kids going to study and read if they have to do that in a car? Let's go to the next slide. Right? There's another, this one is about naming root causes. We like to say things like root causes, but it's important for us to actually show what those root causes are. In this example, a reporter from the New York Times wrote a story about how jobs were not paying enough for people to be able to pay exorbitant amounts of rent. And in this case, the example was of a woman who was making about $70,000, who worked as a housing navigator, I believe, or a social worker for an organization in Seattle, helping to find homes for people. And she couldn't afford an apartment. She lives in her car with her daughter who was in college. And that story told that systemic problem and that systemic and root cause. It didn't talk about that. It didn't talk about it as a systemic root cause. It talked about the actual cause, right? And really gave an example in a story that really brought that out. Let's go to the next slide. Focusing on solutions, we want to show people, right, what we are for. We want to give people the North Star. And we want to be concrete about that, right? We want safe and quality housing that everyone can afford. We want people to have access to doctors and a safe place to call home, right? All of the pieces of what our solutions are, right? So that we can help people start to think through, that solution for Housing First, for example, makes a lot of sense, because right now we are in a bit of a solutions narrative moment where everyone agrees that homelessness is terrible for everyone involved. Where the tension lies is around the solutions. There's a battle for solutions. One side is saying drug testing before you can have a home. Our side, which is evidence-based, says you have to give people a home, put them somewhere safe, and then help them to get the services that they need when they need it. And that's right now where some of those tensions lie. In addition to encampments is another is another solutions challenge that we face, because people don't like the visibility of homelessness. And so things like arresting, ticketing, and fining people are all about, right, a tactic to deal with the visibility of homelessness, but it's not about solving homelessness. And so we are facing a public tension around some of that, because clearly people also don't want to see encampments in their communities or in their parks. Let's go to the next slide. These are all focused on solutions. Show people what you are for. Give them the North Star. Let's keep going because some of these are videos and I know we're having some challenges. Oh, can you all, I can't tell if that's coming out or not. No? Okay. Let's go to the next slide. And I love to use this is our call to action. We can back up one. The second to last piece is providing a compelling call to action, right? So giving people something to do so that they can be a hero in the story, so they can be a part of the story. So join, learn, vote, call a legislator, sign a petition, educate yourself, share our social posts, follow us, donate, you name the thing. And I love to include this example because you can go to the next slide that shows the example. Oh, no, let's go back. 2 more. Yep, 1 more. There you go. So I love to include this because our friends in St. Paul, Minnesota were passing a ballot measure around housing. And there was a local restaurant that joined in and said, for every taco, burrito, etc. you buy, we will donate to this housing coalition so that we can get this proposition or this legislation passed, right? Something fun, but really concrete around a call to action. Let's go to the last one, which is all about, yep, thank you. Being really clear on your goals and your audience, right? The goals, why are you doing what you're doing? Right? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And then the second piece, which is your audience, yep, you can go to the next slide, is target your audiences. And you can go to the next slide after that. You want to target your audiences. And this is really important because different messages move different people. One of the great things about narrative research is that it helps you identify unifying narratives. And there are also audiences that will hear things differently based on their experiences. So it's really important that when you are thinking about the narrative essentials, thinking about what am I doing and why, what is it that I want to accomplish, and then who am I talking to, and what do I want them to do? And I believe we're at the end, so we have a few minutes to jump into questions. Oh, Jay, can you hear us? I don't know if you are managing our questions.
Yes, he'll be there in a second.
Okay, sounds good.
Omar, so while Jay is getting his camera and stuff together, let's see if we have any good questions in the chat for you. You here, Jay? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I had a tech difficulty myself. My Wi-Fi just completely went out at 4 o'clock, but great. Thank you, Marisol, for a very excellent presentation. I always realize, like, having these webinars, I always learn something new. And this in particular, I don't often think about the power of narratives and how simple yet incredibly intricate it is. Like when we write something, it completely changes the way we think about it, and that perception is incredibly powerful. The framework really taps into that ethos of the issue, and you really said it best yourself, is that people understand or respond first and foremost with their emotions. And I think that's an incredibly big part of the narrative and really reaching into that like heart and soul of the issue, and of course the heart and soul of the person itself. And I think I also want to like maybe paraphrase that quote, but like if you want to change the hearts and minds, you kind of have to know what's in them. I don't know. I thought that was like, that was great.
Yeah, yeah. Highly recommend everyone listen to that Hidden Brain episode. I think it's called actually Changing Hearts and Minds. It's really fascinating, and it's very much about the conversation we're having now.
And it's funny that you say that, Marisol, because that's actually a question on here. What episode was that on Hidden Brain? But let's go over some.
It was a recent one, actually. I want to say right? this year. It was one. It's an episode from this year.
Yeah, that's great. So let's go over some of the questions here. I know we're running a little bit over, but I want to have the time for some folks to have their questions answered. So I see one from Lahela. Lahela's curious. I would assume they're wondering about what the dialogue shift is happening around the country about housing first. Marisol, can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I really appreciate that because it's so critical. We are facing an opposition, and I'm sorry, what was the name of the person who asked the question? Lahela. Thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it because what we are seeing is a very strong effort across the country to dismantle housing first. And we're seeing that with these opposition groups that I've mentioned. And the challenge that we are facing is that we have to talk about housing first in a different kind of way. We talk about it in a very wonky way, which is as a policy. I gave you that example. That was actually from a website where that was how housing first was described. But I think we all can pretty much agree that when you have a home, right, you are able then to get yourself the healthcare you need. If you need to get services, any of those kinds of things, it becomes really important to have a home first. And so talking about housing first in terms of what it means to somebody who has a home first and then the services that they need is a really important sort of first step to introduce it to people that may not be familiar with it. I will tell you, I have a lot, because I was a former journalist, I talk a lot to journalists and people in sort of the communications field, but not all of them in housing. And I will say to them, if I tell you if I ask you, what is housing first, what do you think of? All of them said, well, it means that you need a house first for anything. Before you are able to do anything, you need a house first, right? No one is talking about it as policy, right? They're very much operating from that sense of feeling and knowing what home means to people. And so what I would suggest for all of us is be thinking about how do we talk about housing first in a way that shows what people gain when we use that as a solution. And we need to be able to do that in order to blunt a lot of the opposition that's happening against it.
Marisol, this question comes from me. I'm just curious because I often hear organizations talk about being data driven, always talking about data. We need the numbers, but how do we make the case, or where does data belong in the narrative? I know it's important to have the numbers, but how do we unmask that so that we don't undermine homelessness as being a human issue, that there is a person behind all of those numbers? That makes sense.
Yes, and I really appreciate that because the numbers and the facts are so important. And what I often will suggest to people is to tell those numbers and or facts either through a story, a personal story, or talk about it in a way that people will understand and resonate, right? So that if you make $50,000 and you have 2 children and you are spending, if you earn $50,000, this is an example of how we could talk about the numbers, right? We could say a Harvard study found that half of the people in this country are spending half of their income or more to rent, or spending it on rent. Or we can say, if you're a person who makes $50,000 and you have 2 kids, you are paying $2,500 in rent. That doesn't leave you a lot to take care of those kids. Go buy groceries for them, food for them, shoes for them, pay for your gas, pay for your car payments if you have one, right? And so you can see we've gone from, one is, I've told you a lot about that Harvard study. The second one is I'm using the same data, but putting it in a slightly more, putting it in a way that will resonate more with people, because people understand what it means to, struggle to get by, to, what is that saying about paying Peter to, taking from Peter to pay Paul? I can't remember that cliche. Sorry, English is not my first language, so work with me here. But there's, right, I mean, that's a real struggle that so many people can understand. And so when we are thinking about numbers, which are important, so I want you to know that I am saying they need to be in there. It's more about how we are bringing them in for folks. If you are talking to an economist, numbers away. Do the thing. But I'm talking to my mom, I can't do that.
Yeah, the representation of those numbers certainly matters. It paints such a broader picture, and it always, like that whole facts over feelings thing. You need both.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a great study out of, I can't remember actually the university, but they did a narrative research study about this very thing, is the role of facts versus story. And what they found is that you need both, but it's around the framing, right? So that you come in first, you do the introduction of it through a story or a lived experience element, and then you can start to talk about some of the data.
All right, so let's take one last audience question here. This is a grants pass thing. How do we incorporate what Justice Sotomayor has preferred in grants pass v. Johnson, such as if every municipality or town and village created a no camping ordinance, then what? No compassion, nowhere for one experiencing homelessness to be or to exist. So I'm trying to understand, so essentially, how do we incorporate Justice Sotomayor's argument on grants pass?
Yes, the justice is saying this isn't a solution, right? This is, the reality is that you are taking this to its logical conclusion. If you arrest, fine, and jail people, when they get out of said jail, or they have $6,000 in fines, guess what? Now they have a criminal record and $6,000 in fines and tickets that you've given them, and no home, no place to live. And if you do that in Grants Pass, and now people are going to the next town over, and the same thing happens, and then they go to the next town over, right? So it's really important for us to be able to show, we can say, this doesn't solve homelessness, this makes it worse. So we have to say, this makes it worse, right? And we've done some actually narrative research with the Law Center, the National Homelessness Law Center, around this very thing. And if you all are interested in that message guidance, just reach out to Jay and he can connect with me, or email me directly at mbayo@housingnarrative.lab.org. And I am so excited and happy to share out that message guidance. But what you all will see from that is that it's important for us to say ticketing, arresting, and jailing people will make homelessness worse. It will not solve homelessness. And the way to solve homelessness is providing housing that people can afford and the services they need when they need it. So we need, from our end, to be able to point to exactly what Justice Sotomayor made mention of and show the solution. We have to tie those two things together because right now people are really kind of flummoxed. There's a lot of empathy. People don't believe that arrest, jailing, and ticketing people is the answer. They do not, and they overwhelmingly reject it, but they don't know what the solution is because they're not seeing the solution, and it's our role to help them see the solution. But how we talk about that solution is what will make the difference, right? Housing that people can afford and the services that they need when they need it. Elected officials and community leaders who choose to solve homelessness and not make it worse. Those are all elements that are important when we are talking about this issue and picking up on some of the comments and perspectives that the justice was providing during Monday's hearing.
Thank you, Marisol. So that concludes our Q&A portion for this webinar. Again, I want to thank Marisol and all of our attendees for joining us today. I want to add again that if you have missed out on a part of the webinar, or if you had a colleague that wanted to attend, we'll send the recording to the emails that you registered in. And again, this is a shameless plug. Go subscribe to our YouTube channel. All the content will be posted there. And if you missed it, Marisol left her email, mbail@housingnarrative.lab.org, I believe.
Yep.
So if you do have any follow-up questions, go ahead and email me or contact Marisol. We'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Again, I appreciate you all for attending. Marisol, again, thank you so much. And that wraps up our webinar.
Thanks, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jay. And thank you, David, for manning the PowerPoint.
No problem. Thank you, guys.
All right, you guys take care.